on section 3 of the handout now on memory and features. And this is going to be some pretty important conceptual material. It might seem simple at first, but it's going to be really important for everything we do for the rest of the semester. Right? So try to make sure you get everything that's going on in this section. And so what we've said so far is that we need a limited number of discrete categories to exist in a language. And that's going to help us explain why lexical entries can only differ in some features, but not other features. And yeah, so then we've also looked at some of the details, although not all of the details yet, about what we think those features are like and how we're going to notate them and formalize our way of discussing those features. And so the idea here is that these are what define the properties, the features, the factors, the dimensions along which words or lexical entries or morphemes can contrast in a language. So we've been assuming so far that morphemes are stored in long-term memory, that is in the lexicon, with their phonological forms, right? We said lexical entries are arbitrary pairings of sound and meaning. This goes back way back to the first class, where we noted that there's nothing about the animal cat that predicts it needs to start with a voiceless velar stop in any particular language. That's arbitrary. That's what we memorize in the lexicon. And so we've been writing this sort of as if, here's cat. Again, these slash brackets are lexical forms, stored forms, underlying representations. The phonetic form or pronounced form or surface form comes in these square brackets. It might have a little bit more phonetic detail, like in general in English that's going to be aspirated and so on and so forth. That part's not super important, but this is the underlying form notation, and we've been assuming that it's written in terms of something like IPA characters, right? So this says we have 3 units in our lexical entry for cat, and they are a voiceless velar stop, a low front unrounded lax vowel, and a voiceless coronal stop. And that's what we've got in our lexical entry. It's treating these segments as special. And this is true for any word in English or any other language. The specific kinds of segments that you have in your lexical entries differ between languages, but by hypothesis, every language has a limited number of contrasting sounds. But what we're saying now is that actually it's features that limit what can be in a lexical entry. And if features are the basic units of lexical contrast in a language, so the fact that, again, cat and pat can contrast in English, but cat and slightly retracted cat can't contrast in English. We're saying that that's because of the features that we have. Well, then it actually makes more sense to think each of the segments in these forms is a bundle of features, sometimes called a feature matrix. And that is what determines the possibility of 2 sounds contrasting or not. Right? So this is shown in the handout for hypothesized underlying form for the word carry. And again, we use the IPA as a sort of useful notational shortcut here, because it's much easier to write this K letter than it is to write all of the features of that sound. But we think that in actual mental grammar, the way that speakers represent information and memorize information about phonological forms like this is not in terms of letters or IPA symbols or single properties that define a particular segment, but instead we think each of these is actually a complex of different features that define that segment. So what's actually in the lexicon here, as shown in the handout, is a long list or a matrix of features for each sound here. So I'm just going to do the K one. What is K? Well, it's voiceless, it's velar, it's a stop, minus sonorant minus continuant is how we encode stops using manner of articulation features, which I'll discuss in more detail shortly. And it has any number of other properties, right? It's a consonant. It's not syllabic. That is, it's not the head of a syllable. It's not a vowel. And, you know, there's all sorts of other features you might want to put in here. But all of these are going to be what's actually represented in our lexicon, this long list of features, not just a single, you know, category with one attribute, namely being a K character. It's actually this list of features. So if we want to explain why this can contrast with pat, well, this is also going to be a matrix of features. And it's going to be, you know, very similar to the other sound, but one thing's going to be different. It's going to be labial, not dorsal, and you know, everything else is pretty much going to be the same. If you change the voicing, you can get another kind of contrast between cat and gat. Gat is, you know, fairly recent and informal English word that means a gun. It's not a very common one, but it's a possible English word for sure. If you change the value of place to some other place, you could get tat or something like that, which might be short for tattoo. If you change the continuancy, you could get, well, not for the dorsal one, but for the coronal one, you could get sat or fat or something like that. But you can only choose from this list of discrete categorical features in order to figure out which forms can be stored in the lexicon in English. Right? And of course, the choice of particular features that are contrastive might differ in other languages, but the idea that every language has a limited menu of features that can define a lexical contrast, that is meant to be universal. Right? So this is our formal theoretical account of why we only have a limited number of possible contrasts in terms of sound structure, in terms of lexical entries, for any given language. Well, actual physical sounds might be pronounced in an infinite variety of ways. The features that make up underlying representations can only differ in certain discrete categorical ways. So this is the basic idea behind almost all of phonology, is that what do we do when we do phonology? Well, let's assume that we start with some kind of a sentence or an utterance that we need to say, and that might be a single word, or it might be a whole syntactic phrase, or an entire sentence. But what we get is, once we're trying to figure out how to pronounce that syntactic tree, we pick out these representations from our lexicon, and we use these IPA symbols, and we're going to continue to use them as a convenient shortcut for writing what kinds of sounds are involved. But the actual theory is that rather than a K letter, what this is representing is a list of feature values, including all the contrastive features of English and maybe some other features that are not contrastive. We'll get there later. But it's going to be actually a list of features. We're going to insert that into whatever place in this syntactic tree we're trying to pronounce, and then at some point we're going to need to feed these through a grammatical system and see how they actually come out phonetically. We're not quite there yet. For now, let's just think of these features as defining both lexical entries and pronunciations, or something like that. Right? So this is our vision of linguistics, of grammar. Right? What happens, you retrieve an underlying form that's arbitrary, that's stored in your mental lexicon. It's stated in terms of abstract categorical features, not in terms of physical speech realizations, which are continuous and infinite. And then you manipulate these representations in various ways that we'll get to later in the semester. And that's what your phonological grammar operates on. These binary, discrete categorical features. You don't operate on an infinite continuum of possible phonetic characteristics. Right? Instead, you have these coarse-grained representations that make up the stuff of phonology.